Hello DevOps people, I'm Jochen and I'm back to do some live coding, some work on our chef cookbooks that we use to run our managed hosting platform and other things. As always, if you have any questions, simply let me know in the chat. I hope the chat will work better today. We had a bit of an issue last week, but I'm pretty optimistic that that's resolved. And if you have any feedback, if you have anything that you'd like me to explain a bit more, simply let me know. And maybe just as a test for the chat, give me a short shout out, and so I can see that I can actually see your mentions. So let's dive right in. I've prepared 4 issues from our issue queue, from our internal chef cookbooks repository, on which I'm going to work. And I hope it'll be interesting to see how we do our infrastructure coding. Let's start with the first issue. It involves our Varnish cookbook. Varnish is a reverse proxy that we use to speed up websites that we host. One issue we have is that we have certain URL paths for Drupal and WordPress that we exclude from caching because caching would screw up things. And this list of paths is hard-coded in the template for our Varnish configuration, which makes things a bit undynamic. Because every time we need another exception, or every time we realize that an exception might not be the best solution, we have to go into the cookbook and directly change the configuration file template. And that's exactly what configuration management is not meant for. So it's time to make this more dynamic and actually put the list of exception paths into its own node attribute that we then can use within the template, and that enables us to change the exception list for each chef node we are running. That makes much more sense, and I only can explain this bad design by the fact that the Varnish cookbook is one of our oldest cookbooks. It's more than 5 years old, I think. And so back in the day, probably I didn't simply think of making it more dynamic. But that's how things are, and it's time to resolve them. Speaking of resolving, it's issue number 156, so I'll create a new branch, 156 Varnish exceptions, and let's take a closer look at our Varnish Freestyle cookbook. Most of the Varnish functionality is in the template directory, especially the default configuration. And here we have different VCL files. Some of them are specific for a single hosting cluster, and my main focus will be on the more generic VCL files that we have here. Starting with the default VCL file for Varnish 3, which we still have in place on many machines. And so let's take a look at the configuration. That's Varnish configuration syntax. Okay, the default configuration doesn't have any exceptions built in, so we can leave that right away. Let's take a look at the Drupal Varnish configuration, which will probably be more complex because Drupal is the content management system that we support besides WordPress. Thanks, Simon, for the feedback regarding the music. I'll tone it down a bit. Yeah, I guess that's better. Interestingly, we already have a more dynamic configuration for whole host names that we want to take out of caching, but somewhere down here we have a whole list of things that we want to exclude from a path perspective, and that's what we need to make more dynamic. And to follow this, here we have a Varnish disable hosts node attribute, so I'll probably simply introduce a disable paths attribute, which looks like it's going to be an array of regex strings, and we'll simply use them in our Varnish configuration instead of this hard-coded list. So let's take a look at the attributes file. There is no exception list so far, so we'll set them here. Default Varnish disable hosts. By default is an empty array. It's a disable host, right? Yeah. And we'll use this list. If at first you don't succeed, take a bigger hammer. Okay, that's better. So Feels like some Vim magic would make the task a bit easier, but it's not above the effort that makes me actually look for a solution. So we're already done. Yeah, something with the dot, but I need to first go into change mode and then replace the existing stuff with a comma. Yeah, a simple substitution would probably have done the trick, but anyway, it's already done. Now, how do we actually code this in Varnish configuration language? We could iterate over the list that we insert here as a literal list, or we could simply generate a number of if statements. And since this is basically C code, which will get compiled anyway, I don't think creating a bunch of if statements will do any harm, because the optimizer will take care of that. So what we can do is node varnish disable paths. Oh, that's why it didn't work. Each do something like this. That is basically the main change. So let's see how it works in Test Kitchen. Okay, we should be able to run something like Drupal. And these waiting periods are mainly the reason why I'm running music in the background. While this is building, I can do a few housekeeping things, mainly updating the changelog file. Each of our cookbooks has its own changelog file where we list all the changes that we make, and we have a bit of an automation built around this, so I can simply add a header named head, and this head word will automatically be replaced with the version and the date, as you can see below. And instead of adding subheaders, we recently agreed upon simply stating for each entry if it's a change, a breaking change, or a fix. And in this case it's a change, make list of no caching paths, uncached paths, dynamic via node attribute. That's that. Okay, there was a problem. Let's take a look at what the problem actually was. Okay, I see. It's a common thing. We still use an older version of the Chef client where the apt repository resource isn't a built-in resource yet, and that's why we need to explicitly add the apt cookbook to our test suite, which means that in kitchen YAML for the suite I'm running, which is the Drupal suite, I actually need the apt cookbook, and since newer versions of the apt cookbook already removed their apt repository resource, I have to pin this to a 5.x version. So okay, bergsfile.log already has apt 614, so I'll have to do bergs update apt. And it uses apt 5.1, which is exactly the version I like. So let's give it another try. Now the apt repository resource should be available, and tests should run fine. The reason that these necessary changes I just made haven't already been made in the repository are probably a typical case of works on my machine, because if you only have an apt cookbook version 5 in your test environment, it will run fine out of the box. But since I already had apt cookbook version 6 on my machine here, things broke. And that's why we have to make things explicit. And eventually have to upgrade our chef client. Just as a short plug, if you like what I do, please follow this channel. And I'll also post the link to our new YouTube channel, where I also have the recordings of my previous live streams. So that does look fine. Let's take a look at the machine itself. Somewhere here below should be a long list of if statements. Here we go. Yep, that's exactly what I wanted and expected. It's not too pretty, but as I said, that's not a problem. For me, it's more of an optimization problem for the C compiler. Now, we shouldn't leave this without any tests, but I'm not sure what we actually do have in terms of tests. So there are a number of server spec tests. Is it just my eyes, or are these two tests completely identical? I think so. Let's see what happens when we run them. Yeah. So let's remove the duplicate. Is there a way to test our exception paths? The underlying web server that I'm installing for testing purposes would have to have content for a path, otherwise it would only return a 404. I'd probably have to build a test environment, a kind of test website that would allow me to test different parts of the website, but to be honest, that's not something I'd like to do on the live stream. It would just be too boring. But it would make sense, and I might actually file a new issue to do exactly that. The way we do this is normally we'll include a sub cookbook in this cookbook that's simply for setting up a test environment, in this case a kind of a website that responds on different paths, and that would enable us then to test different paths with or without caching exceptions and see if actually we get a cached response or not. And that might be something I'll do next time with a bit more preparation. But for the time being, I think we are good. If there only was this file that we need to change, but there are more than this single file. So let's take a look at the other stuff. There are more files that are mostly identical but differ in small details. And yeah, I think I'll replace them all. I'll modify them all because we want to have consistent behavior, don't we? So we'll go ahead and replicate this loop. But I get the suspicion that there are paths that didn't get included in the first one. Things like this Ajax blocks. How many lines do we have here? 20. And how many attributes do we have here? 20 as well. Okay, seems to be consistent. Fine. So let's the WordPress setup might have a different mode of operation. At least different. Different exceptions. I'm tempted to simply add them because they won't make much of a difference. And we simply could vary the actual node attribute depending on if we are running on a WordPress cluster or a Drupal cluster. Otherwise we'd have to maintain two different lists, which I don't like. Okay, Simon in the chat is voting for the separate lists solution. He's actually a colleague of mine from our operations team. Okay, if we do this, let's do it right. And what do I mean? I mean the following. We'll actually define different lists. So something like this. WordPress. Why didn't it work? That's that. And this time, oops. This time let's use the substitution thing. Substitute blank pipe at the end with a simple comma. And we'll do the same up here. For the Drupal setup. And we'll allow for a custom set that by default is empty. And then we can do something like this one-ish. Disable path list and simply say which list we'd like to use. So these are just predefined lists for different use cases, in this instance Drupal and WordPress. And we could even set disable path list to custom and then modify custom ourselves in a role or somewhere else. And that way we could we could simply select the list we'd like to use. And in the recipe where we write the configuration file, we just add another variable, disable paths, that is node varnish disable paths, and node varnish disable path list. Let's think about backwards compatibility. So far we had different lists for different templates, and that needs to be maintained. Yeah, I can't be too dynamic here. So let's go one step back here and simply provide two kinds of lists and use them in the respective template. So let's go back. Oops. Go back here into the Drupal template. Yeah, 2014, by the way, so this is quite old. That's the disable hosts, and we'll simply use disable paths Drupal. And in this case, it's disable paths WordPress, and we can still choose okay, that's a doing it with the custom list is a valid objection. I guess I'll need to process it a bit. Let's go with this and see how it feels. So okay, here we already have the right thing. Drupal 7 needs the additional hash key. Box is actually supposed to be the unified VCL that we'll be using in the future. So we'll actually have to give it its own list. I'm just scrolling to see if it has some CMS specific stuff, but I don't think it has. Not if I'm not completely mistaken about its purpose. So disable paths should be its own list. No, I don't remember which list it was. I guess it's the same list as we had with Drupal. Seems to be the Drupal. Okay. I'll go ahead and give it its own list. And for the time being, simply use the Drupal list. Exactly. We just have explicitly defined use cases, and we might need to tweak them a bit, but we don't need a complete generic use case, because we simply don't have it. So that's that. Let's take a look at the WordPress one. Yeah, that's been already updated. And everything else is so specific that we don't have to change it. These more specific things should keep on working as they did, because they were specific in the first place. I think that's that. Let's see, what did we change? We changed Drupal, Firefox, WordPress, slide fix to the default test. What did we change in the recipe? Oh yeah, okay, that's well, that's actually okay from a style perspective. Adding the comma makes things easier to maintain and to shuffle around. So I leave that additional comma in, even though I don't add another value below. Okay. Should have no side effects, because out of the box cookbook should still behave as it did. Okay, that's that. I'll run a few tests later to make sure I didn't break anything, but so far I think we're good to do a pull request later. Okay. Now, since we are already in the Varnish cookbook, we could do another small test, another small change from this issue, change to current RSpec syntax. That's an issue I filed quite a while ago, because I wanted us to use the RSpec 3 syntax with expect, but in the meantime, Chef Software came out with inspec, and inspec has its own syntax that's, I guess, still based on the RSpec2 syntax, but I'll be happy to use that. So what we could do is actually translate the tests we already have from server spec to inspec, which will make the verify phase a bit shorter. Just a tiny bit, but every little bit counts. So let's do this, but let's do it in a different branch. Let's see, did I commit and push everything? Yep. This is issue number 83, and well, just let's call it in 83 inspec. And let's take a look at our integration tests. So there is a Drupal and a WordPress test, and a few extra ones, and they are both server spec tests, and we'll translate them to inspec tests, which shouldn't be big of a problem because they are pretty similar. Things get easier too because we can move everything a directory higher. So what I'm going to do is actually go ahead and move test integration Drupal server spec default spec into test integration Drupal, and then completely remove. Oh, I should have used git move, but I think Git will take care of that. Git remove test integration Drupal server spec. Yeah, it actually detected that I renamed the file, and we'll do the same for the WordPress test. Test integration WordPress server spec default spec to test integration WordPress, and remove the rest. That's that. And of course, we need to take a look at the tests themselves, if they are proper inspec syntax. We don't need the spec helper anymore. And the rest looks pretty good. Of course, we'll have to remove the duplicate test here. Let's take a look at the WordPress test. We can remove spec helper, and it looks good as well. But of course, we need to actually run them. So we'll do another converge. Our kitchen configuration already defines inspec as the default verifier, and that's why we don't need a subdirectory named inspec or anything else. Oopsie daisy. Once again, yeah, we need to repeat what I did before with the apt cookbook. Otherwise, things won't run. So, let's go into the Burks file. Make sure we have the apt cookbook in version 5. And let's also use it in our test suite. And let's use it in the WordPress test suite as well. Same as before. Bergshelf already uses apt6, so we need to kinda update that. It's not an upgrade. Here we go. This is actually quite interesting because this is basically kind of pair programming live with Pyromorph's participation in chat. And we might actually do a pair programming session live sometime in the future. Final lap, varnish gets installed. Shortly after that, it should deploy the configuration file and the converge phase should be done. And I'm going to go right ahead and start the converge for the WordPress configuration with the WordPress test machine, and I'll do the verification of the Drupal test container in parallel. I'm at least optimistic that Test Kitchen can do things in parallel without any locking issues. No, come on. Go. Fine. So let's go ahead and launch WordPress as well. And I'll simply go into a different terminal and use Kitchen Verify. Drupal. Let's see. Well, it's a bit short. Didn't actually do anything. Why not? We do have a test integration Drupal directory. No, even using an even older apt cookbook, in that case version 2, shouldn't make any difference, because the main difference is simply that Chef recently added the apt repository resource to the official set of Chef resources. So it automatically subsequently got taken out of the apt cookbook, and but since we don't run a Chef version that has the resource built in, we still need to rely on apt cookbook version 5 or earlier. But running it on version 5 should be okay. So why didn't Kitchen care to run the test suite for the Drupal suite? What is going on? Should we make the verifier more explicit? Yes, we should. Fine. Looks good. And yeah, the nice thing with InSpec is that it's more or less built into ChefDK, so as you saw, the spin-up is much faster than if it has to first install the server spec scaffolding and stuff. Meanwhile, our WordPress test instance is also almost done, so we can verify that as well soonish. Brilliant. Yes, current apt cookbook is at 6, and if you look at the changelog, you'll see that the main breaking change is that they took out the apt repository resource. Which simply makes our tests fail, since we also pin the chef version to 12.6 where there is no built-in apt repository resource. Okay, let's do the final lap here. Good boy. And let's check this one. Don't break, don't break, don't break. Nope. Good. Okay, looks like at least I didn't make any major screw-ups, and the VCL is still valid. We could take a look at the WordPress configuration here and see if it actually uses the right list of paths. Do we have a list? Yeah, we do. Let's see, varnish default VCL. And if you go down here, oh, that doesn't look good. That's the old static one. Did I forget to change this? No, I didn't. I'm in a completely different branch where we still work with static lists. Okay, yeah. Got the two issues mixed up. This one is simply about replacing server spec with inspec, which I think is a success. We'll simply move the rest as well. So we'll need to fix the C160 WordPress test. Same process as before. Test integration C160 WordPress server spec defaults varnish spec. Interesting. I think we should make it more consistent. Test integration C160 default spec.rb and git remove the rest. And test integration Drupal extra cookies. Test integration Drupal extra cookies server spec. Thank you. Okay, so let's make sure this works. All valid stuff. Again, duplication of this test. And how about the extra cookies stuff? Extra cookies are always good. Okay, this should work as well. So what I'm going to do is take a look at this. It's just mostly rework and the apt cookbook stuff. So I'll make a commit and a push, and then I'll run the whole test suite with all the convergence runs and see that it actually works, but I don't have to do this on stream because it's completely boring. We'll call this switch from server spec to inspec. Why is this necessary? Well, it's good to use the officially supported well, let's leave it at that. Verifier. No much of an argument here, and it resolves issue number 83, which I should comment. Well, I'll actually mention in my pull request that it's not exactly a switch to the more recent RSpec syntax, but a switch to the inspec verifier framework. That's that. Got everything. Push it. And yeah, I'll go ahead and run a kitchen test on this to make sure everything works as it's supposed to do. And but I won't keep you waiting for the results. I thank you for joining me in this. I'll be back on Thursday at the same time. And I'll either do a few more issues, or what I am more likely to do is to refactor one of our longest chef recipes, because it's our main chef recipe actually, and in order to make in order to enable a feature development that we are going to do, I need to refactor this recipe. It's far too long, and it has far too many parts that need to be factored out into their own resources or library functions or things like that. And I think it will be a good example of how to do refactoring with chef recipes actually. I always thought that, well, in pure Ruby, of course, you have to adhere to certain style things, like the length of methods should be limited to a few lines and things like that. But you can't do that with the Chef DSL. Well, actually you can, because Chef enables you to isolate things into their own custom resources, into helper methods and things like that. And that's what I intend to do, and it'll be either on Thursday or next week, depending on how much time I have for preparation. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions, tweet me, email me, or simply send me a chat message. If you liked what I do, please follow me, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.